The glasses chimed softly beneath the golden wash of fairy lights, each sound like a small bell in the dusk. The garden glowed with warmth and laughter. Beneath the tinted lights and the soft hum of old love songs, Lena stood near the edge of the patio, her fingers around a glass she hadn't touched. Her parents' anniversary party shimmered with all the brightness she never seemed to belong to. She watched her mother move through guests like a star that refused to dim, her father's laughter booming above the music. Everyone looked happy, radiant, weightless, and then Grace arrived. The crowd turned, and light seemed to find her like it always did. Grace's dress caught the lantern glow, and her parents' faces changed. Their eyes brightened, their backs straightened. Her mother let out a cry of joy, her father lifted his arms. The music didn't stop, but something inside Lena did. She clapped softly, smiled politely, and took another step toward the shadows. For years, she had trained herself to fade this way. It wasn't sadness so much as practice. When Grace spoke, people listened. When Lena spoke, people nodded out of kindness. She had learned the quiet craft of being unseen. Her sister moved through the guests with grace, hugging old family friends, catching up on lives that adored her existence. Lena's gaze followed her like tracing light with weary eyes. "Lena, dear," her mother called briefly over her shoulder. "Could you fetch more napkins from the table?" Lena obeyed, smiling as if that small command tethered her to belonging. The napkins were folded neatly in a wicker basket. She carried them back, setting them down beside the cake. 3 tiers, white with lilac ribbons, a centerpiece that seemed to belong to a movie. Her mother kissed Grace's cheek again. "You look radiant, my darling." Lena's hand stilled over the tablecloth. The evening rolled on with soft music and talk of holidays, new houses, Grace's promotion. Lena nodded when addressed, but never invited the next question. Someone mentioned her teaching, and the conversation swiftly turned back to Grace's wedding plans. When her father rose for a toast, the music softened into silence. He raised his glass high, his voice booming with affection. "To my wife," he said, "and to our girls, our pride and joy." Applause rippled. Lena smiled because it was expected. Then her mother, her cheeks flushed from champagne, lifted her glass, laughing. "Sometimes," she said with that careless, glowing humor that always carried a small truth, "I think if we'd only had Grace, life would have been perfect." Laughter followed. Not cruel, but warm, oblivious laughter. Grace's eyes widened in alarm. Her father chuckled awkwardly. But the air changed, only Lena felt it. The room blurred around her, and in that suspended heartbeat, she knew that sentence would never leave her. She smiled anyway. A soft, polite curl of lips that kept her steady while her insides folded in on themselves. "Mom," Grace began, but her mother waved it off with a sip of champagne. "Oh, I'm just teasing. You know I love both my girls," Lena nodded, pretending to find it amusing. "Of course," she said gently. The music resumed, and the noise filled the gap where her heart had been. After a while, she slipped away, past the buffet table, past the laughter that no longer sounded like music. The garden outside was dark and still. String lights swayed slightly in the wind, and the scent of cut grass mixed with lilac perfume drifting from the house. She leaned against the railing and stared at the night sky. The stars were faint, scattered. Her reflection glimmered in the glass door behind her, a silhouette, nothing more. Inside, Grace's laughter floated out like a song she used to know the words to. Lena traced her wrist absent-mindedly. The bracelet was there, thin cord, small beads, handmade when they were children. Grace had made it at summer camp when they were 10 and 12. "So we always match," Grace had said then, looping the twin bracelet around her own wrist. Lena still wore hers, though faded now, threads worn smooth with years of quiet touch. She thought about the night they made them, sitting on the porch steps, mosquitoes buzzing, their mother inside on the phone, their father at work. They had shared orange juice from the same bottle, their laughter filling the emptiness. Grace had promised then they'd never grow apart. But promises made in childhood often dissolve against the edge of adulthood. The door creaked. Grace stepped out, arms folded, eyes unsure. "There you are," she said softly. Lena didn't turn right away. "I needed some air." Grace hesitated, standing beside her. The glow from the house fell gently over them both, but Lena kept her eyes on the dark garden. "I'm sorry," Grace said finally. "Mom shouldn't have said that." "She didn't mean it," Lena gave a faint smile. "I know," Grace's voice wavered. You know how she gets after wine. She doesn't think before she speaks, Lena nodded. She never did. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile, just old, worn. The kind of silence built over years of not saying enough. I tried to stop her, Grace whispered. But you know them, they only listen when they want to. Lena looked at her then. Grace's face was beautiful as always, but softer now, guilt dimming her brightness. It's fine, Grace, Lena said gently, voice almost tender. Some people just shouldn't have had 2 children. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Grace's breath caught. Don't say that, Lena shrugged lightly. It's true. Some people can't love twice. Maybe once is all they have to give. The garden lights flickered as wind stirred them. From inside, their father's voice echoed another toast, laughter rising again. Grace looked at her, eyes shining in the soft glow. You're still their daughter, she whispered. Lena's lips curved into a quiet smile that wasn't really a smile at all. Maybe, but that's not the same thing as being loved. Neither spoke after that. The air was cool, smelling faintly of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, lonely and small. Grace reached out like she wanted to touch her sister's arm, but stopped halfway. The gesture dissolved into her pocket. Are you coming back in? She asked. Lena shook her head. No, I think I'll head home soon. Grace hesitated, searching her face for something to hold on to. Lena, It's okay, Lena said softly. You don't have to fix it. Go enjoy the party. That's your world in there. Grace's mouth opened, then closed. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Good night, then. Good night. Grace turned and slipped back inside, swallowed by laughter and light. Lena stayed where she was for a long while, staring at the faint shimmer of stars above the house that had never felt like home. She could hear her mother's laugh again through the door, bright, careless, beautiful. Her hands trembled once before she steadied them on the railing. The bracelet glinted under the light, a faint reminder of something she wasn't sure she still believed in. When she finally left, it was quiet. Her footsteps against the gravel were the only sound. The night wrapped around her like a thin blanket, cold but honest. And as she reached her car, she whispered to herself, not bitterly, not even sadly, but with a strange kind of calm, it's okay. I see me. The wind caught the words and carried them somewhere into the dark, where they finally belonged. The drive home was long and dark, the road cutting through fog like a quiet river of glass. Lena didn't play music. She liked hearing the hum of the tires and the way the rain began to whisper against the windshield. It was better than thinking, though she thought anyway about the toast, the laughter, her mother's voice echoing like a bruise she couldn't touch without wincing. The bracelet on her wrist tapped softly against the steering wheel. She turned it absent-mindedly, counting the worn beads as the headlights carved their way through the mist. By the time she reached her street, the world had grown still. The houses slept in their neat rows, curtains drawn, lives folded neatly away. Her own home waited at the end, small, ivy crawling up one side, the porch light flickering like an old heartbeat. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of paint and rain. She'd left a candle burning earlier, the wax now pooled around the wick, solidified in uneven waves. The house wasn't much, just 2 rooms, a narrow hallway, and a corner where her easel stood facing the window. But it was hers, and that made all the difference. She hung her coat by the door and kicked off her shoes. Silence welcomed her like an old friend. There was no judgment here, no measuring of worth. Only the hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her reflection in the window looked distant, softened by the lamplight. The woman staring back seemed older than she remembered, though not by years, by weight. The kind you can't see but always feel. A photo hung near the window. She paused before it, fingertips grazing the frame. 2 girls ages 7 and 9, muddy and grinning at the camera. Grace's arm was around her shoulder. The photo had always been crooked, and somehow Lena had never straightened it. It belonged that way, tilted, imperfect. She turned toward the living room, where canvases leaned against walls like quiet witnesses. Her sketches covered the table, half-finished faces, soft shades of gray and blue. She painted children mostly. Children with open eyes, children who still believed they were seen. Teaching them every day filled her with a quiet warmth, though she never told her parents much about it. They didn't ask. They didn't need to. Their world had no space for small, beautiful things that didn't shine loud enough. She sat on the couch, pulling an old wooden box from beneath the coffee table. It was carved with small flowers, edges smooth from years of touch. She lifted the lid. Inside were letters, folded, yellowed, some sealed, some half-written. They weren't for anyone, and yet they all had names on them. Mom, Dad, Grace. She unfolded one and read. The ink had smudged in places, as if written with too much emotion and not enough care. Dear Mom and Dad, I know you love Grace more. I think I'm okay with that. I just wish sometimes you'd look at me like I'm not a mistake that never quite became her. She stopped there, staring at the words. She remembered writing it in her 20s, the night before she moved into this house. She'd been sitting on the floor with a single lamp on, tears drying on her cheeks, whispering to herself that leaving was not the same as giving up. She folded the letter back carefully, tucking it under the others. Then she reached for another, this one unsent, written 2 years ago. Dear Grace, I miss you, though I wouldn't know how to say it if we ever talked again. I wish you'd see that I'm not angry. Just tired. You carried the light and I carried the silence. I think we both got lost somewhere in between. She traced the words with her finger. A drop of water fell from her hair onto the paper. It had started raining harder outside, tapping against the window like fingers begging to be let in. She set the letter aside and walked toward the fireplace. Kneeling, she opened the grate and placed one letter inside. The paper crackled, edges curling as flames licked upward. For a moment, the warmth felt like forgiveness. But halfway through, she pulled it back with tongs, blowing out the ember before it could consume it entirely. Half-burned words. Half-healed wounds. She left it there on the hearth, the blackened corner curling inward. Her easel stood waiting by the window, a half-finished painting under dim light. She approached it. The brush still rested in a jar of cloudy water. On the canvas, 3 figures stood together in a soft, pale landscape. A family of 3. She'd painted her parents and Grace. The 4th space, on the far left, remained blank, outlined faintly in pencil but never filled in. She dipped her brush into the paint, hesitated, then lifted it away. She couldn't finish it tonight. Not yet. The rain grew heavier. It blurred the streetlights outside, turning them into halos in the fog. She stood there for a long moment, just listening. The sound of water, the soft creak of the house, the faint hiss of wind through the window frame. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She walked over slowly, half dreading, half hoping. A single message blinked on the screen. Grace, can I come by tomorrow? Please? The words pulsed against the glow, simple, tentative. Lena's thumb hovered over the screen. Her heart moved in 2 directions at once, toward and away. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned off the lamp and sat by the window, watching the rain trace soft rivers down the glass. When they were young, Grace used to draw faces in the fog on windows. Smiling ones, always. Lena had drawn stars. Tonight, she lifted her finger and traced a small, uneven star again, the glass cold against her skin. Please, Grace had written. That one word lingered longer than any apology. She thought of the tree house they once built behind their childhood home, the one where they'd promised to be sisters forever. No parents allowed, Grace had written on the wood. Lena had believed her then. Now, years later, she wondered if the tree was still standing. She stood, walked to the fireplace again, and picked up the half-burned letter. The words were barely legible, edges dark. She slipped it into the box again, placing the lid gently back on top. The wind howled softly outside. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a low, rumbling sigh across the sky. She turned back to her easel. The blank figure on the canvas seemed to watch her, patient, waiting. Not yet, she whispered to it. But soon. She brushed her hand over the frame and blew out the candle. The room fell into darkness except for the faint light spilling through the rain-wet window. Lena sat on the couch, pulling a blanket over herself. She let her eyes drift closed, her breath steady and slow. Tomorrow would bring something. She didn't know what. But for the first time in a long while, she felt the quiet shift inside her, like a locked door beginning to open. The bracelet pressed against her wrist as she folded her hands, the beads cool and smooth. Outside, the rain softened to a gentle rhythm, as if the night itself was whispering her name. And in that small, quiet house where every shadow belonged to her alone, Lena dreamed not of being loved, but of learning finally to love herself. The morning came slowly, pale and clean after a night of rain. Light dripped through the blinds like liquid gold, landing on the quiet surfaces of Lena's small house. The air smelled of wet earth and coffee brewing in the kitchen. She had been awake since dawn, sitting by the window, watching drops roll down the glass and split apart before falling away. When she heard the knock at the door, it was soft, hesitant, the kind that doesn't want to intrude. Lena opened it to find Grace standing there, clutching a paper bag of pastries. Her hair was still damp from the drizzle, her face drawn but gentle. For a moment, neither spoke. "I brought croissants," Grace said, holding up the bag like an offering. Lena stepped aside wordlessly. The faint smell of butter and rain followed Grace in. They sat at the table without ceremony, coffee between them, the air heavy with all the things that had been unsaid for years. The clock ticked in the corner, steady, unbothered by the weight between them. Grace broke the silence first. "I didn't sleep last night." Lena stirred her coffee. "Me neither." "I kept hearing Mom's voice," Grace continued quietly. "That stupid toast, I kept thinking. What if you never come to another family thing again? What if that was the last time we were all together?" Lena's gaze drifted toward the window, where fog clung to the glass like breath. "I don't think they'd notice if I stopped coming." "That's not true." Lena's eyes lifted, steady but tired. "Isn't it? When was the last time Dad called me for anything that wasn't about you?" Grace winced. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," Lena said softly. "But it's true." Grace leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I didn't ask for it, you know. The attention, the praise. It wasn't fun being the golden child." Lena's mouth curved faintly. "It looked pretty golden from where I was sitting." Grace looked down at her hands. "It was heavy, actually. They decided who I was before I did. Perfect daughter, future doctor, always smiling. I couldn't fail, not once. If I got a B, Mom cried. If I said I was tired, Dad said I was letting everyone down." Her voice cracked on the last word. She blinked hard, then took a slow breath. "They made me a mirror. I had to reflect what they wanted to see." Lena's fingers stilled on her mug. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, "I was the shadow behind it." Grace looked up, eyes glossy with guilt. Lena rose, walking toward her easel. "I painted something last night," she said. Grace followed her, hesitant. The painting stood by the window, the soft morning light falling across it. A family of 3, painted in soft, muted tones: mother, father, daughter. And on the far left, a faint outline of another figure, barely visible, sketched in pencil. Grace stared at it, breath catching. "That's you." Lena shook her head. "That's who they wanted me to be. Someone they could see." Grace moved closer, reaching out but not touching the canvas. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's unfinished," Lena replied. They stood there for a while, the quiet pressing against their ribs. Outside, a bird called once, twice before the silence swallowed it. Grace's eyes moved to the mantel, where the half-burned letter lay. She glanced at her sister questioningly, but Lena didn't explain. Instead, she said softly, "Do you remember the tree house?" Grace blinked. "The one behind the old house?" "Yeah. We built it with Dad's leftover planks. It leaned so badly Mom said it would kill us." Grace smiled faintly. "You painted stars on the ceiling. I wrote 'No parents allowed.'" Lena nodded. "That was the last summer before things changed, before everything became about who we'd be, not who we were." Grace's smile faded. "I still remember the smell of that tree, the pine, the sap. I remember you falling asleep up there once and I carried a blanket out to you." Lena looked at her. "I didn't know that." "I never told you," Grace said, eyes soft. "You were shivering, And I didn't want you to wake up and think I cared because you always looked like you didn't need me. Lena almost laughed, a small, disbelieving sound. I always needed you. The admission hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Grace's eyes filled again, and she reached for Lena's hand across the small table. This time, Lena didn't pull away. I'm sorry, Grace said, for not seeing you, for letting them make me into something that made you disappear. Lena's hand tightened slightly. I don't blame you. Yes, you do. Lena hesitated, then nodded faintly. Maybe I did, for a long time. But it's not really your fault. You were just the one they loved out loud. Grace let out a shaky laugh. And you were the one they forgot to whisper to. They sat in silence for a while, fingers still linked. The coffee had gone cold, but neither cared. Grace eventually rose and walked around the room, taking in the sketches and small paintings. Pinned to the walls, faces of children laughing, holding paintbrushes, chasing sunlight. You're incredible, she murmured. They should see this. They wouldn't understand it, Lena said. It's not the kind of success they can toast to. Grace turned, eyes bright. Then maybe they need to learn. Lena looked doubtful. After all this time? After all this time, Grace said firmly. We can't keep pretending we grew up fine. You think I don't see how brittle they are? How scared? They built their love like a house with only one door. Maybe it's time we open another. Lena looked at her sister, searching her face for the child she used to know. And for the first time in years, she saw her. Not the shining perfection, not the favorite, but the girl from the treehouse who once whispered, "We'll always have each other." Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small and faded. A Polaroid. She handed it over. Lena looked down. Two girls, hair tangled, grinning at the camera, sitting in the crooked treehouse. On the wood behind them, faint words scrawled in marker. No parents allowed. I found it in one of my old journals, Grace said softly. I kept it all these years. Lena's throat tightened. She brushed her thumb over the image, the edges worn soft with time. You kept this? I never stopped missing that day. Neither spoke for a long time. The quiet wasn't heavy now. It was full, alive with something that had been sleeping for too long. Grace looked out the window, then back at her sister. Come with me, she said suddenly. Where? Home, Grace said. Just once more, we can face them. Not for them, for us. Lena's breath caught. The idea felt impossible, absurd. Grace, you know what it's like there. You know what they'll say. Maybe, Grace said, or maybe they'll say nothing at all. But we'll be there together this time. And that changes everything. Lena looked at her sister, at the sincerity in her face, the soft stubbornness that mirrored her own. She thought of the painting, the letters, the half-burned confessions. Maybe this was the missing brushstroke. Her fingers brushed over the Polaroid again. The girls in it smiled as if nothing could ever pull them apart. Just once more, she murmured. Grace smiled. Not wide, not perfect, just real. Just once. The clock ticked softly. Rainlight shimmered on the windows. They sat together by the fireplace, the untouched pastries cooling between them. Grace leaned her head against Lena's shoulder. You know, Grace whispered, you were always the brave one. Lena shook her head. No, I just learned how to survive the quiet. Maybe that's what bravery is, Grace said. The fire popped softly, a single spark rising and fading. For the first time in years, Lena didn't feel alone in her own house. The walls seemed to breathe with them, the silence no longer a void, but a blanket wrapping both in fragile warmth. Outside, the clouds began to lift. Somewhere in the clearing sky, the sun reached through, pale, hesitant, but there. And in that, quiet morning. With the past sitting between them like an old photograph come to life, two sisters began, slowly, to find their way back. The morning after the storm was gentler than anyone expected. The air smelled of wet pine and ash, and the first light of dawn painted the world in soft gold. Daniel woke to the quiet drip of melted snow from the eaves, each drop echoing against the window pane like the slow rhythm of healing. His eyes wandered to the old photograph on the nightstand, the one of him and his sister Eliza, sitting side by side under the apple tree, grinning, their knees scraped, their hands sticky with juice. It used to hurt to look at that picture. But now, it felt like a promise. Something broken, yes, but still holding shape. He rose, his movements unhurried. The house was still, save for the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the heater. Down the hallway, his mother's laughter floated, small, tentative, as if testing whether it was allowed again. When he walked into the kitchen, she was standing by the stove, stirring something warm and sweet. She looked up, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in years. "Coffee?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Please." She poured it with care, the steam rising between them like a thin veil. When she slid the mug across the counter, her hand brushed his. Just that. A fleeting touch. But it carried an apology too large for words. "I found something," she said after a pause. She reached into the drawer and pulled out an envelope, worn at the edges, the paper softened by time. "Your sister left this for you before she went to the city. I thought you should have it now." Daniel stared at the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Eliza's looping script, the same she used on Christmas cards and notes taped to the fridge. He hesitated before opening it, the silence between his mother and him growing heavy with memories. Inside a single page, folded twice. He unfolded it slowly. "Danny," it began, "I know you think I'm the favorite. Maybe I am, but not for the reasons you believe. Mom and Dad always saw me as the one who could keep this family together. But I saw how much weight they put on you too. The quiet one. The one who never asked, never broke, never needed. You were always carrying us without anyone noticing. If I ever made you feel unseen, I'm sorry. I love you, and I want you to be free. Not from them, but from the hurt. Don't stay small because of old wounds. There's light in you, Danny. Let someone see it." He sat there, eyes wet, as his mother turned away, pretending to busy herself with the pan. But her shoulders trembled. "She wrote that?" he whispered. His mother nodded. "She mailed it to us the day she left. I couldn't bring myself to give it to you back then." The clock ticked. The world outside had gone quiet again. He folded the letter back, carefully, reverently, as if it were a fragile piece of his sister's soul. "I forgive you," he said finally, not just to her, but to all of them, and maybe to himself most of all. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove out to the lake, the same one where the family used to picnic when things were simpler. The water shimmered under the pale sky, calm, endless. He took a deep breath, let the cold air fill his lungs, and exhaled slowly. In his hand, he held a small wooden box, one of his father's old keepsakes, the kind used to store cufflinks and coins. Inside, he had placed Eliza's letter and a photo of all four of them, taken before everything fell apart. He knelt by the edge of the lake and set the box down on the damp earth. "This is where we begin again," he murmured. When he stood up, he noticed something unusual, a small group of children playing by the water's edge. One of them, a girl with red mittens, ran up to him, holding out a pine cone. "Here," she said. "It's lucky." He took it, smiling. "Thank you." As the children ran off again, their laughter echoed across the lake, mingling with the wind. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an unwanted child. He just felt human. By the time he returned home, the house smelled like cinnamon and something baking. His father was sitting in the living room staring into the fireplace. He didn't look up when Daniel entered, but his hand shifted, patted the seat beside him. Daniel sat. For a while they said nothing. Then his father cleared his throat. "I saw what you did for your mother," he said. "She told me. I should have said this a long time ago, son. You were never the mistake. We just didn't know how to love right." Daniel's throat tightened. He nodded once, the words too fragile to speak. His father sighed. "Maybe it's not too late to learn." It was a small sentence, almost lost in the crackle of the fire, but it reached the deepest part of him. They sat together, the flames dancing across their faces. As the day slipped into evening, Daniel walked out to the porch. Snow began to fall again, soft, steady, unhurried. He tilted his head up and let it touch his cheeks, melt against his skin. Through the window, he could see his parents, moving slowly around the kitchen, setting plates, sharing quiet conversation. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But maybe that was never the goal. He looked up at the sky, the faint stars beginning to show through the clouds. Somewhere, he liked to imagine Eliza was smiling, maybe standing under a similar sky, maybe whispering something to the wind. He pulled his coat tighter and went back inside. The warmth met him halfway, and for once, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. At the table, his mother placed a plate before him. His father raised his glass, a quiet toast. "To family," the old man said. Daniel hesitated, then raised his own glass. "To trying again." And in that small, ordinary act, in that imperfect, hopeful silence, the years of distance began to close. When the night deepened, and laughter replaced the old ghosts that used to haunt the corners of that house, Daniel excused himself and walked to his room. On the desk sat a fresh sheet of paper, waiting. He picked up a pen and began to write. Not to anyone in particular, but to everything that had led him here. "Dear Eliza, you were right. There's light in me. I just had to stop waiting for them to see it, and start living it. Thank you." He folded the page and placed it beside the letter she left him. Then he opened the window. The cold night air slipped in, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the echo of his sister's laughter. Somewhere far off, a bell chimed midnight. Daniel smiled to himself, eyes glistening, and whispered, "I'm home." If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.